Well, good morning. Good to see you guys today. I'm so glad that you decided to be here today. My goodness. We've made a lot of decisions already this morning. I don't know if you realize that. You've made tons of decisions already. I mean, starting with you woke up and you looked out the window and you said, should I get up? Right? And you got up. Congratulations, you're here. Right? You decided what you were going to wear. You decided what you were going to eat for breakfast, right? You decided if you were going to come to church today, right? You've made a lot of decisions already. It's actually said that the average adult in America makes 35,000 decisions every single day. And you're wondering why you're tired, right? It's not the clouds, it's the decisions, right? Yeah? There are decisions that you want to make, that you get excited about making. There are decisions that you do not want to make. And there are decisions that you feel like you don't have to make, right, until someone really presses you on it. I think the thing that maybe stresses me out, one of the things that stresses me out the most in my life is having to order my food at a restaurant. I don't know about you, but I'm like the guy who you sit down with and I just want to socialize with you. And then somehow, the server comes by the table and they say, is everybody ready to order? And it always feels like everyone says yes, but me. So I'm the guy who says, hey, just start with them, and by the time it makes its way around, I'll have an answer for you, And I know that when that starts, when they start asking someone for their order, it's go time, right? I got to lock in now. I got to come up with something. And so this is why I love going to places where I already know what I like. It makes everything so much simpler, Because I know that I have to make this decision. And even if it comes back to me, and I decide I don't know what I want and whatnot, I could just not make a decision, but in not making a decision, I'm going to end up fasting, right? That's my decision, okay? Right? There's actually a philosopher, William James, in the late 1800s, who said something very simple. He says, when you have to make a choice and you don't make it, that in itself is a decision. That in itself is a decision. I think this is where a lot of us can find ourselves with God. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. I'm so glad that you're here. I hope that you feel very welcomed here. We want you to be here. But maybe you're here and you're like, I haven't rejected God, and you haven't done that in your mind per se, because here you are, you're here. Right? But maybe you're here and you're hoping to not make an ultimate decision to follow God at some point in your life. You're just looking for a little religion or a little help, in some area of your life. But if in and of itself, not making a decision is a decision. And that's exactly where we find ourselves in our story that we've been going through in the book of Elijah. So I want to invite you now to open to the book of 1 Kings chapter 18. If you were here last week and you weren't here last week, just remember that 1 Kings in the Old Testament, it's going to be right after 1 and 2 Samuel. And if you've gone to Chronicles, you've gone too far. So no shame in using your table of contents, honestly. But we're in 1 Kings chapter 18, and what we see here is people who are living in the illusion that they can have like a worship buffet. Right? That they can drag their feet on making a decision about who they're going to worship. That they can just have a little bit of everything, right? And that if they don't make a decision somehow, they can avoid God altogether and keep living the way that they want. God's people, the Israelites, we're told, are fence riders. And it makes sense because their king is Ahab, which if you remember last week, we looked at Ahab very briefly. He's not a good guy, okay? He's the king of Israel, though, and he's done some things that kind of signal that he's not all out on worshiping Yahweh yet. I mean, he's named two of his kids names like owned by Jehovah and Jehovah is exalted are some of his kids' names, okay? So you don't name your kids like that and just because you like the way it sounded, in that kind of day. That meant something. But at the same time, he married Jezebel, who's like the wicked witch of the West. And he's married this woman and brought her in, and she has put on payroll these false prophets that are trying to lead people astray to worship all these Baal gods, okay? But she's gone even further than that, we learned today. She has sought to kill and put an end to all the prophets of Yahweh, of Israel's God. She's been killing prophets. And Ahab is just sitting back like that's not a big deal, that he doesn't need to make a decision about that. And God says, enough is enough. And so if I could put it this way, in our narrative this morning, the server is going around the table and it's go time, right? God's people need to make a decision. And the question that God is asking you this morning is, who is going to be your God? Who is going to be your God? And so because our text is asking that question, this really is a kind of message, a sermon that is pressing that into your heart this morning. Maybe you're here and you've been kind of just fidgeting around, sprinkling God into your life. He's not even first among equals. He's maybe not even equals. He's just a part of your life in some fringe way when you have time for him, right? And God is pressing in this question to our lives. Who is going to be your God? Right? There's a wet line, a line in the wet cement drawn, so to speak. And God is saying, where will you stand? And his challenge to us is go all in. And that's what we see here at the beginning of the story. In verses 1 through 21, this is the challenge that Elijah presents to God's people. It's to go all in. Let me summarize here for you, because there's a lot of text this morning. But let me summarize for you what's happening in verses 1 through 16. There's a lot happening. You get introduced here to a guy named Obadiah, who's a righteous man. And he's the head of Ahab's household. So he has an important job. And we learn here that he has been hiding God's prophets in these caves by the 50s, feeding them bread and water to keep them alive. Because remember, Jezebel's trying to kill all of them. It's almost like a Holocaust, like Corrie ten Boom kind of thing that's going on here. Right? He's protecting these prophets and keeping them hidden. Right? And so Ahab calls to him one day, and he says, hey, we've got to find a place for our donkeys and mules to eat and live. Because remember, there's been a drought for 3.5 years in this land. So do you see the contrast that's being set up here? Obadiah is trying to keep alive God's prophets. Ahab is trying to keep alive these donkeys that don't really matter all that much. And so he goes, I want you to go out, Obadiah, and to find some grass that we can keep these donkeys alive. So Obadiah goes out, and when Obadiah goes out, he finds this man Elijah, right, that we've been talking about. And Elijah's been hiding for 3.5 years, if you remember, because he stood up to King Ahab's face, and he says, there will not be any rain in this land until I say so. And so he's causing a lot of problems for God's people. We learn now that Elijah's been hunted. They're trying to find him and kill him. And so Elijah appears to Obadiah, and Obadiah loves Elijah, and he's like, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. And Elijah says to him, hey, go grab Ahab, I want to talk to him. And Obadiah says, I don't want to do that, because if I do that and God takes you away to some other place and I bring you back and you're not here, they're going to kill me because they want to kill you. Okay, and Elijah gives them this promise, just go and get Ahab, I will be here. And so that's what's happening. For the first time in 3.5 years, you have Ahab showing up to meet Elijah. What happens? Verse 17. Ahab says to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah answered him, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. A word. So they finally meet. And the way that Ahab greets Elijah is saying, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, I'm not the troubler. You're the troubler. See, in Ahab's eyes, we're in this mess of a drought because of what you said. Right? You're the troubler. And Elijah looks at him and goes, no, we're in this mess of a drought because you've led God's people away from him and you have not been following his commandments. So who's right? Like, who's the real bad guy, right, in the story? Well, Elijah has this idea, right? He has this idea. And he asks for all of Israel to get together at Mount Carmel, and once everyone is gathered, Elijah comes near to all the people and he challenges them. Right? When you get to this point, it's almost like you should hear like a drum beat behind the story or something. Like this is, the tension is building here. And he goes, hey, if the Lord is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. Right? Stop limping, is what he says. When I was in middle school, I grew up in Helena, Montana, and my great-grandmother had this land out at this lake called York. And she had this little creek that ran through her land, and she had peacocks and all this crazy stuff out there. And we loved to go out there in the summertime, and I would play in the creek and float the creek. And one day I'm out there in the summertime, and I'm jumping across rocks in the creek, and I fall, and I nail my knee against a really sharp rock. And it just splits open, and there's lots of blood. And, some of you are like, shut up, Josh, stop taking, some of you are like, give me more details, what's going on, that kind of thing. And so suffice to say, I had to get 7 stitches. Okay, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't fun to be a middle schooler and not be able to bend my knee for 2 months. Like you got to imagine, middle school is rough a little bit as it is, and here I am, I can't even walk cool, I'm just walking with a stiff leg the whole time. See me go downstairs, it gets worse. It was a rough season. And so I remember after 2 months, I finally got my stitches out and I could walk normal. But I had forgotten, my body forgot how to walk normal. So I would try to bend my knees as I walked. I looked really, really dumb, right, for so long. And you would say I had this limp, right? We all know what limping is, right? Maybe you've had a limp at some point. And a limping is a vivid word because what does it mean? It means you're not at full strength. But it also means you're not paralyzed. Like you're still moving, but something's really broken there. Something's off. Here, Elijah's using it as a symbol of half-heartedness, right? You're kind of going back and forth between God and between this other God, but you're limping. You're not going all in one way or the other. You're kind of walking, but you're really not, right? It looks weird. It's not wholehearted devotion sort of stuff. This is the word, and so he says enough is enough. Right? If Baal is your God, go after him. If God is your God, then pursue him. And what do they say in verse 21? What does it say? They say nothing. But silence in and of itself is a response, right? It is a decision. Now you have to be wondering, if you're reading the story, like, why would there be silence? I mean, what was so cool about Baal that would make even the decision about who's going to be your God to be hard? For us, we look at people like this and we go, with all these primitive people, they worship all these gods and stuff like that. Like, why would that even be hard? It doesn't seem like it'd be hard for us. But Baal worship was very appealing to people. Number one, it appealed to power, right? If the queen of the land is Jezebel and she has the power and she's saying this is the worship of the land, then to worship Baal would make you an insider, right? Does anyone like being an outsider? If your culture around you is saying, this is what you should do, this is what you should think, this is what you should say, there's a lot of temptation there to just bend in there somehow. At least do something to show that you're not completely on the outside, right? There's the allure of power, right? There's a allure of history, right? Baal worship was very old. It goes all the way back to the land of Canaan when the Israelites crossed the Jordan. It was there. It offered an appeal of relevance, right? You needed more grain, you needed some oil, right? You needed a good crop one year. Baal is the god of the storm, right? So he provided water in their eyes. So when Baal was on his game, things were good. That's the thought. And if things aren't going good, maybe I should go down the street and give a little altar worship or something to Baal because I need some help. But finally, it provided an appeal to sensuality. They had sexual rites built into their liturgy, right? So Baal allowed you to serve him with all your glands, right? If you had an itch, Baal would promise to scratch it. And if he couldn't, he had a friend who was another god that you could go and worship, and he could scratch it for you. Right? It was very appealing in so many different ways. And so we might not feel the tension of why the silence, if this was posed to you, if it's between Baal and Yahweh. And so we might not have Baals all over Redlands. You might not have a Baal idol set up in your house. But see, you and I have little Baals that are set up in our hearts. And for some of us, there are far more Baals set up in our hearts than there were even in Israel at the time. And so this is not merely a battle for your mind this morning. This isn't just like, what are you going to decide? This is a battle for your heart. This is always a battle for your heart. And so God says to you this morning, go all in. Go all in. Do you have a pantheon of gods in your heart? Decide which one will be your God. Is Jesus one of many gods in your life? Be honest about that. Right? How do you get to this place? I mean, how are you a nation like Israel, whose God has redeemed you in these powerful ways? How do you get here? Well, it's by making all these 35,000 decisions every single day of your life. You worshiped your way into this place. And now Elijah is saying, decide, worship your way out of it, one way or the other. I mean, do you see how intense this is? If the Lord is God, follow him. And Elijah, God's prophet, says, if Baal is God, follow him. Think about how intense that is. He's pushing them to the extremes, to their logical ends. So if Elijah were to show up here this morning, it's very likely that he could say something like this to us. He could say, if money is your God, then serve it with all your heart. Just go for it. Get all that you can. Don't give any of it away. Keep as much as you can. If that's the ultimate good, then cheat if you have to get it, right? If you have to throw your integrity away or sacrifice that person to have it, then do it. Just go for it. If people liking you is your God, then just go all the way, right? Do whatever you can to get everybody to like you. Do whatever it is that would earn their approval. Manipulate people. Use people. Constantly change who you are depending on the environment that you're in. Say whatever you want to say, or whatever they want you to say, or do whatever they want you to do if it'll make them like you, right? But then you got to keep doing it, or else they'll reject you. If beauty is your God, then serve it with all that you have, right? Spend all the money that you can, and all the time that you can, and all the thoughts that you can on how you look, right? Or what your image is, and the material things that you have. If romance is your God, then go all the way. Right? You're unhappy, then leave your marriage. Leave your responsibilities. Right? If you found somebody else, who cares who they're married to? Just go and love them. Right? Just go experience that in your life. If pleasure is your God, then make all of your fantasies come true. Give yourself away to whoever you want and whenever you want. Consume whatever you can to make yourself feel good. If you think that's what's going to fulfill you, if that's what you want to do with your life, then go all in. Just do it. I don't know how you're feeling right now. Maybe you're like, whoa, you know? Like, can a pastor even say that, right? Are you going to cut that clip and put it out there that that's what they're preaching at Pathway? You know, that kind of thing, right? Just do whatever you want, you guys. But that's what Elijah's doing. Do you see that? He's saying, stop limping. Make up your mind. Who is going to be your God? How will you decide? Well, maybe the real God will really stand up. Let's look. Elijah has an idea. What's his proposal? Verse 22. He goes, well, which God is real? That's point number 2. What's his idea? Verse 22, Elijah said to the people, even I only am a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it to pieces, lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I'll prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he's God. And all the people answered, sounds like a good idea. All right, so the stakes are made. It's 450 to 1. Elijah challenges them to a showdown. Baal has home field advantage. They're on Mount Carmel, which all of Yahweh's altars have been torn down. All of Baal's altars have been resurrected. I mean, Baal is the storm god. And the stipulation is he just got to send down a lightning bolt from heaven and light this place up. You know, it's a drought, 3.5 years. You got 450 people. There's just me. I mean, who you betting on? right? Those are pretty good stakes. Well, what do the Baals do? What do they do? These prophets, verse 25. What does it say? Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourself one bull and prepare it first. For you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. So what do? They took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they, look at this, they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he's relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep, or he must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, which is in the evening. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. I mean, it's like the silence of Baal is as quiet as people's response to who will be your God. This is deafening. So what do? They limp around this altar that they've made. They put the bull on the altar. They limp around. And Elijah's mocking them because nothing's happening. What does he say? Oh, just yell a little bit louder. Maybe he's on vacation, or maybe he's asleep, he's tired. You got to wake him up. Or maybe he's going to the bathroom, or he's deep in thought, right? These are all the comments that he's making to these people. And do you notice these comments? He's drawing out something. He's not merely mocking them. What he's drawing out is that if we make gods ourselves, we naturally make them into our own image. And so therefore we should conclude that they have certain characteristics that we do, right? Like they get tired like we do. They have a long day and they need a vacation like we do. Oh, we go to the bathroom, they have to go to the bathroom. They get spaced out deep in thought, well, because we do, Right? When we make gods into our own image, this is the conclusion, right? And he's revealing to them through all this. He's pointing out, he's drawing out of them, this God is not just made up. He's not real. He's not real. And so they try harder. They cry out louder. They start cutting themselves. They're bleeding all over the place. This is an intense scene. They're trying really hard. They're sacrificing. You would think that Baal would just have a moment of kindness and go, man, look at what they're doing. I should probably send a lightning bolt. But there was no voice. Nobody answered. See, this is what gods will make you do. If you pursue anything other than God himself, the true God himself, they'll make you work really hard. They'll make you sacrifice yourself. They'll make you cry louder. They'll make you cut yourself. They'll make you work and dance and move and try to conjure up some type of response. Every God in this world will make you do that for them. But what will Elijah's God do? Right? Will he just take, just like this Baal God will do? Well, no. What does God do? Verse 30, Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. Right, so you have Elijah come near to the people. Now he's saying, come near to me. And all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he built a trench around the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood, and he said, fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time, and they did it a second time. He said, do it a third time, and they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I've done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. We see here to start out, Elijah repairs the altar, meaning it wasn't being used, which tells you that his initial comment that you're limping between two opinions is a pretty generous comment, right? Were they even limping to the other side? And so what does he do? He grabs these 12 stones that you don't have to make up what is that, because it tells you they're representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he has them dump 12 buckets of water on the altar and on this bowl. The narrator wants you to know that God's people have tried to find a different identity, but he's going to restore that identity. Because when he came to Jacob, in the book of Genesis, he says, your name will be Israel. This was way before they even went into Egypt and became slaves. God had not forgotten who they are. And so there's a lot going on here that's hard for us to pick up on. If you're an Israelite, your alarm bells will just be going off, because there's a word in here called the oblation offering. Have you guys used that word in a sentence this week? Anybody? Oblation, right? Okay, me either. Okay, I just used it now. Right? This is my first time. But oblation offering, this was an offering that we're told in Exodus that they were supposed to offer every morning, every evening. They would offer a lamb for sin. They clearly haven't been doing that because the altar's been torn down. But what happens? They don't offer a lamb. What do they offer? A bull here. And in the book of Exodus, we are told that if you are offering a sacrifice for sin, for an entire nation, an entire people, a lamb is not enough. You need to offer a bull. Do you see what Elijah's doing here? Repairing the altar, restoring the name of who God's people truly are meant to be, who their God is supposed to be. He's offering not a lamb, but a bull for the sin of all of Israel. And he digs this huge trench around. They pour all this water all over the wood during a drought, nonetheless. Why? Because he's not just showing off. He's not like, my God's cooler than your God. He's just making sure that when that altar gets lit up, that no one will say, man, it's fire season, Who knows? Maybe it just started. This would have to be an obvious act of God. God is heightening his disadvantage here, if you could say it that way. So Elijah comes near, and what does he do? Does he limp? Does he dance? Does he scream? Does he cut himself? He just prays. See that? What does he say? Verse 37. He's praying for God's name, for his renown, for his fame to be realized right in front of everybody. He's praying. Why? Because this is life and death. Not just for him, though it is, because if God doesn't show up here, they're going to kill him, right? They've been trying to kill Elijah. But if God doesn't show up right now, this is life and death for Israel. And we learn this right there in verse 37. Answer me, that this people may know that you are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. This is a plea to God to bring his people back. God, do this. Turn their hearts back to you. So he prays, and fire falls. And notice the total language of this. It's crazy. The bull's gone, the wood is consumed, the stones are missing, the dirt is gone. I don't know how that's possible, right? And the water is licked up. That's total language. Have you guys ever licked a bowl of ice cream before? Have you ever done that? Don't lie. I got some agreement here in the front, right? Ice cream's amazing, okay? remember when I was a kid, I'd do the thing where if I didn't like the meal, I'd spread out my food to make it look like I ate something, and my parents were like, you got to finish it. And I'm like, how much more? And they're like, all of it, Like I never licked up a lot of meals that I ate growing up, but if my parents gave me a bowl of ice cream, I'm licking that baby, Right? That's total language. I'm not wasting any of it. It's completion language. There's nothing left to consume. God has taken all of it. But look over in your mind's eye to Baal's altar. There's still a bowl. And it's a mess. Right? Guys, how are you going to respond to this story? That's this last point that we see here in the narrative. How will you respond to this morning? What did the people do? Verse 39. When they saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." This is the climax here, because this was the thing, right? If the Lord is God, follow Him. If Baal, follow him. And then the stipulation was in verse 24, the God who answers by fire, He is God. And they said, it's well spoken. That's a good idea. The Lord answered by fire, they fall down and they go, He is God. He is God. Right? They worship Yahweh. They go all in on Yahweh. They worship before the prophets of Baal are doing anything else right now. They don't care what it's going to cost them, even if it's going to cost them their lives. They worship. This is their response. This should be our response. This will be your response to the God you choose. It's worship. But then there's more. Look at verse 40. Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Let not one of them escape." And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. And this is where many Californians sigh, right? Like, man, we were having so much fun on top of Mount Carmel, and then here we go, right? This savage God again in the Old Testament, another moral problem with the Bible. This is kind of how we feel. And I'll be honest with you, it's not like we read this and we're like, yeah, verse 40 is amazing. Like no one reads verse 40 and gets excited about it. If you do, I don't know what that means, but most people don't do that. But guys, there's a few things that I want you to see here, because it's actually very, very important to your response. One, you must know that this was not an act of revenge, a personal act of revenge by Elijah. This is actually just in line with their law, because Israel was a theocracy, and in places like Deuteronomy chapter 13, there's things stated there that basically say, if you lead or if you woo God's people away from worshiping Him to worship another God, you forfeit your life. So Elijah's actually just carrying out their constitution. But I would go deeper than that and say that we are confronted with our own thoughts here. Because when we get to a verse like verse 40, if you're anything like me, you can be tempted to think, man, I'm kind of nicer than God is. I'm kinder than God. But do you really think that you're kinder than God? Don't miss this. God's severity does not condemn him, and His severity does not condemn Elijah. God's severity condemns us, and it condemns us when we look at something like verse 40 and we don't get it. When we look at verse 40 and we go, I don't think rejecting God's that big of a deal. Why would it forfeit these people's lives? But guys, God does not use breath mints on cancer. He uses surgery. And if our hearts have all these gods in them, then keeping them around and keeping the people around that are leading us away to worship other gods, leaving food and water out for them so that they might come back and we can entertain them and play footsie with our sin a little bit longer, it's not going to work. We're going to keep limping. And so God says, get rid of the things in your life that are leading you astray. And it's important then for us to see that the God of this story is the God that we're worshiping this morning in this room. He's the God reigning over this room today. Our sin is not a light thing in the eyes of God. Our fence riding is just not an option. And I think if this story doesn't help us see that, I think a helpful picture is what we see in a marriage. Because the metaphor that God most often uses in his relationship with you is marriage. That Jesus is a groom and we are the bride, right? I don't know anybody in this room. I mean, I've heard Will Smith has some open marriage or something like that. He's not here though, right? I don't know anybody in this room who marries somebody and is like, yeah, go have fun around town, right? Just go cheat on me with whoever you want. Does anybody want to go on a date with their spouse and their eyes are just wandering and looking around at everybody else but them? Does anybody want to go and be with your spouse and they're flirting with other people while you're spending time with them? No, you're jealous for the love of your spouse. And that's good. You want their faithful love and devotion because you stood up in front of a bunch of people and you covenanted with God and before other people that you were going to be faithful to them until death do you part. And this is the exact same thing. So if you are a Christian in this room, that means that you have come to the place where you've given Jesus your life and you said, rule me and save me. I need your forgiveness and I need you to lead me. I trust my life to you. That's what it means to be a Christian. And God says that you have now entered into a covenant relationship with God, and he is jealous in love for you. He's a good God. He doesn't say, yeah, go do whatever you want, right? Flirt with this other God over here and that kind of thing. That's not who God is. And so before we go thinking that God is lacking in mercy, look at where the fire falls. Where does the fire fall? On the altar. Guys, in the Old Testament, fire falling was a bad sign. It meant judgment. It didn't mean grab your s'mores and come near, right? It meant, hey, get away. And so you think that when the fire fell, it would have fallen on the people, right? But it fell on the altar that had the 12 stones, the 12 buckets representing the people, standing in place of the people. We actually get a very illuminating picture of what's going on here in Luke chapter 9. Jesus is with his disciples and they're in Samaria, which is really close to Mount Carmel. And what happens in that story? They reject Jesus and his disciples go, hey, should we call down fire to consume them? They're thinking, hey, remember when Elijah did that? That was awesome, right? Should we do that to these people that just rejected you? And Jesus rebukes them and he basically says, you don't get it. You don't get it. What don't they get? Well, in our story, Jesus isn't the true and better Elijah. He's the true and better Israel. He's the one who is the 12 stones. He's the one who is the 12 buckets. Jesus is the one who never limped in this world. He wholeheartedly and devotedly obeyed his Father. He never bowed his knee to a lesser God that he made in his own image, even when he was tempted to do so in the wilderness. He never had an idol in his heart. He knew no sin, and yet he became sin, and the fire of God's judgment fell from heaven upon him when he hung there on the cross until every last drop was satisfied. I don't know if you've ever been out to the Hoover Dam. Have you guys ever been to the Hoover Dam? Yeah, there should be an image for you if you've never been there. Pretty epic place, right? But I've heard this before. I think it's a helpful idea in my mind. I want you to imagine you're standing downstream from the dam, looking back at the dam, okay? And let's just say you're looking back at the dam and it's just massive. You feel small. And you notice a little crack at the bottom, and then that crack gets bigger, and you're noticing, oh my gosh, this dam is going to break, okay? And imagine the dam breaks and a 500-foot wave is just rushing towards you. What are you thinking? Where's my phone? I got to get a picture, right? I mean, some of you are thinking that, no, I doubt it. You're like, I'm going to die. This is it. But let's just say that right before it reaches you, the ground in front of you just opens up in a massive chasm and sucks down every inch, every last drop of that water. Right? How are you going to feel after that if your life is spared? You're going to feel relief, right? You're going to be kind of happy, you might say. Guys, Jesus is the one who does that for you and I. He's the one who stands in between us and God's judgment. And he drinks down every last drop of that judgment that was meant for us. And he drinks it down and he turns it over, every last drop, down to its dregs. And he looks you in the face and he says, "It is finished. I've drank it." You don't have to cut yourself. You don't have to dance. Right? You don't have to shout louder. I did it. Right? The real God stood up on Mount Carmel that day, but really, the real God came down, didn't he? He came down to meet you where you are. Mount Carmel is amazing because the same God that sent down fire from heaven is the same God that sent his son into the world to solve your sin problem, to fix your limping. Right? He's the only God who won't make you bleed for him. He's the only God that'll bleed for you. He's the only God who doesn't say, "Hey, give me that, and I'll take that, and I'll take this," but he gives, and he gives, and he gives. So how will you respond? What happens here? Verse 41, Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up and eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing rain." And Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel. And he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees, and he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And he said, "Go up again 7 times. And the 7th time he said, Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." And he said, "Go up and say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stops you." In a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and he ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So after 3.5 years, God sends rain. There's a lot that could be said here, but what I want you to see is the picture of running, because that's the important image. What have God's people been doing? Limping. What do the Baal prophets do? They limp. What does Elijah do? He outruns a chariot. He got no problem limping. Right? This is a picture in the Bible of what it looks like when you go all in. You run. You don't scenically meander. You run. Every person in the Bible, this is the image of running. Hebrews 12 famously, "Lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, he endured the Hoover Dam." Right? He endured the cross, despising the shame. He's seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Run. Don't limp. I had to share this with you, but I've always been impacted by this story that 100 years ago, there was a group of brave Christians that were known as the One-Way Missionaries. Have you heard of these people? They encountered the God at Mount Carmel and they didn't yawn. They said, "We want to follow him." And they were known as the One-Way Missionaries for 2 reasons. One, they always bought a one-way ticket to the mission field and they didn't know when they were coming back. And 2, they packed their belongings in a coffin. It's pretty intense. Some of you were like, "Yeah, I'm going to do that," and some of you were like, "Well, that's a little over the top," and maybe it's over the top, But they're trying to send a signal. Like, their whole point is that I've died to myself. I've died to this world. And one of those men who did this was named A.W. Milne. And he went to the New Hebrides, which is filled with these tribes of headhunters and cannibals who missionaries would go to all the time to try to share the gospel, and every single one of them would be martyred. But he packed everything in a coffin. He says, "I'm going." And he showed up, and he lived there for 35 years. And he loved those people, and he served those people. And they said, "How did you do that?" And he says, "Well, I already died. I heard he died." And this is what I love, because those people put an epitaph on his tombstone when he died, and they buried him there. And that tombstone said, "When he came, there was no light. And when he left, there was no darkness." Why? Because this man ran. He didn't limp. And maybe you're never going to put your belongings in a coffin and go across the ocean. That doesn't have to be the picture of going all in. Maybe going all in looks more like Obadiah, who lives a quiet life and just stays faithful to God, even when everybody else in the world is going after the Baals. But you know who your God is. At minimum, going all in does not look like half-heartedness. And so this morning, the line has to be drawn. As a pastor, I love you guys. And I'm asking you to take this seriously. I know on a rainy, cloudy day, you're like, I don't feel like to make any decisions, or, we should just go back, that kind of thing. But God did not call us in his room so that we would observe a contest, so that we would yawn and go, wow, that was cool. Hey, what are you doing for lunch? Or do you want to go see a movie? That kind of thing. No, these stories are in the Bible so that we would go, yeah, who is going to be my God? Who is going to be my God? That the real God stood up on Mount Carmel that day. But more than anything, you guys, the God we're worshiping this morning, he came down and he calls you to him and he says, stop limping, decide. Let's pray. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. And you're just looking for a little bit of Christianity in your life. I hope and pray that you would take this time to consider the gods that you give your life to and Jesus who bled for you. Don't wait another day. Entrust yourself to him. You could pray right now and you could receive him as the Lord and Savior of your life. You can confess your sin. The Bible says whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. That can be your life today. I invite you to do that. Maybe you're here and you are running. Praise and celebrate that with God. I pray that you'd feel encouraged this morning. Keep going. But I sense maybe the majority of us are in this room and we're limping. I know I pray this morning that you would cry out to God right now and you would decide. You would go all in. God, I pray that you would free us from our sin. I know there's probably people in this room, Lord, that are just miserable this morning because they're half-heartedly following you, and I pray that you would, by the power of your Spirit and by the transforming grace that you show us in Jesus, that you would liberate them to go all in with you today. Show them what that looks like. Show them, Lord, what it is that they need to get rid of, what they need to eliminate from their life. I ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.